On the morning of the 17th of October 2011, a woman known to the residents of a quiet Geneva neighborhood as Alani Severine applied a final, delicate brushstroke of lead tin yellow to the restored canvas of a minor Dutch master. Her studio apartment, overlooking the placid waters of Lake Geneva, was a testament to a life of curated solitude and artistic dedication. Shelves were lined with pigments in glass jars, the air smelled faintly of linseed oil and turpentine, and a pair of placid Persian cats dozed in a patch of sunlight. To any observer, she was the embodiment of her carefully constructed legend, a gifted art restorer and consultant, a woman of independent means and quiet disposition who had chosen a life of scholarly pursuit over social ambition. Yet the true nature of her work lay not in the delicate layers of paint, but in the sophisticated array of microelectronics concealed within the hollowed-out legs of her oaken easel, and the purpose of her residency in Geneva had nothing to do with art, and everything to do with a man codenamed the Alchemist, the unseen financial architect behind a series of devastating attacks that had stretched from the Levant to Western Europe. Alani Severine did not exist. She was a meticulously crafted phantom, a living weapon deployed by Mossad's Caesarea division, and her true expertise was not in the restoration of art, but in the systematic deconstruction of clandestine financial empires and the men who built them. The problem facing the Institute, as Mossad is colloquially known, was one of frustrating intangibility. For nearly a decade, a militant organization known as the Black Star Brigade had demonstrated an unnerving capacity for logistical and financial resilience. Despite targeted strikes against its leadership, the disruption of its training camps, and the interception of its arms shipments, the organization's operational tempo remained alarmingly consistent. The reason, as determined by a joint task force of analysts from the agency's research and intelligence divisions, was their financial network, a decentralized and brutally efficient system that was not merely resilient to attack but seemed to actively thrive on chaos. Conventional methods of financial intelligence, which relied on tracking transactions through the global SWIFT system, had proven utterly ineffective. The brigade's money moved through a shadowy, layered ecosystem of informal value transfer systems, primarily Hawala networks operating out of the Middle East and South Asia, obfuscated cryptocurrency wallets, and high-volume, small-denomination cash smuggling operations that were statistically impossible to distinguish from the background noise of global commerce. Every attempt to follow the money had ended in a labyrinth of shell corporations registered in non-cooperative jurisdictions, dead-end crypto tumblers, and the impenetrable wall of trust and blood that defined the Hawala system. The organization's funding was an apparition, a ghost in the machine of global finance, and at its center was an equally spectral figure, the Alchemist. The escalation from a persistent threat to an imminent crisis occurred in the spring of 2010. A coordinated series of bombings in Brussels, targeting public transportation hubs during the morning rush hour, bore all the hallmarks of the Black Star Brigade, but with a new level of sophistication and lethality. The explosive devices were constructed using commercially available chemicals, yet they were triggered by highly advanced, military-grade encrypted radio detonators that should have been far beyond the group's technical capabilities. An analysis of the financial forensics from the attack's planning phase revealed a sudden, massive injection of capital, estimated at over 12 million euros, that had been laundered and distributed to the operational cells in under 72 hours. This was not the work of common criminals or low-level financiers. It was the signature of a master craftsman, someone who could conjure vast sums of clean, untraceable cash on demand. The Brussels attack was a declaration. The Alchemist was not just a bookkeeper for terrorists. He was a strategic enabler, a force multiplier who could equip a disparate group of extremists with the resources of a small state. The intelligence community's previous failures were no longer acceptable. The conventional playbook of sanctions, asset freezes, and surveillance of known financial institutions was obsolete. The Alchemist had to be found and neutralized, not just to prevent the next attack, but to collapse the very foundation upon which the Black Star Brigade was built. The stakes were no longer merely strategic. They were existential. The profile of the Alchemist, compiled by Mossad's psychological division, was a study in contradictions, a portrait assembled from digital echoes and the fearful whispers of captured low-level couriers. His true name was unknown. his nationality a matter of speculation, and no photograph of him was known to exist. He was believed to be in his late 50s or early 60s, educated in the West, likely with a postgraduate degree in economics or finance from a prestigious American or British university. Unlike the ideologically fervent fanatics who carried out the brigade's attacks, the alchemist was assessed to be a professional, a mercenary motivated not by religious conviction but by a combination of immense greed and a profound, nihilistic contempt for the international order. He was a pure practitioner of his craft, a man who saw global finance not as a system for creating wealth, but as a flawed, exploitable organism ripe for manipulation. His operational security was legendary. He never used electronic communications that could be traced to him. He never met with operational cells directly, and he never touched the money himself. He functioned as a pure architect, designing the intricate, multi-layered conduits through which funds would flow, delegating the physical and digital execution to a trusted circle of lieutenants who were themselves firewalled from one another. His genius lay in his understanding of systems, both human and technical. He exploited the seams between international banking regulations, the cultural intricacies of informal trust-based financial networks, and the inherent anonymity of the burgeoning world of cryptocurrency. He was not just a financier. He was a systems theorist who had weaponized the global economy against itself. The operational environment in which the alchemist moved was as complex and fortified as his digital practices. He did not operate from a fortified compound in a failed state, but was believed to move seamlessly within the highest echelons of European society. His chosen method for the final stage of money laundering, the point at which vast sums of illicit cash needed to be integrated into the legitimate economy, was the international art market. This world, with its tradition of privacy, its use of intermediaries and free ports, and its subjective valuation of assets, provided the perfect cover. A single, mediocre painting could be purchased for $50,000 and, through a series of fabricated provenance documents and collusive appraisals, be resold at auction for $2 million, transforming dirty money into clean, respectable capital gains. The alchemist was thought to use a network of complicit gallery owners, auction houses, and private collectors to wash his funds. This placed him in cities like Geneva, London, and Monaco, surrounded by the wealthy and powerful, insulated by layers of lawyers, wealth managers, and the cultural deference afforded to patrons of the arts. Penetrating this world required more than just a good cover. It required an operative who could genuinely inhabit it, someone who could speak the language of art history, understand the nuances of pigment chemistry, and navigate the complex social codes of the European elite with absolute confidence. The challenge was therefore twofold: identifying a ghost who lived in plain sight and inserting an agent into a closed, insular world, where a single misstep in etiquette could be as fatal as a failed dead drop. The proposal that emerged from the Caesarea division was audacious and carried an exceptionally high risk of catastrophic failure. It was codenamed Operation Gilded Cage. The plan rejected all forms of direct assault or technical surveillance as primary tools, acknowledging that the alchemist was too disciplined to be caught by such methods. Instead, the operation would be a long-form, deep-cover human intelligence mission, a patient, multi-year endeavor designed to place a single operative so deeply within the target environment that they would eventually be drawn into the alchemist's orbit through sheer professional gravity. The core concept was to weaponize expertise. The operative would not be a spy pretending to be an art expert. They would be a world-class art expert who was also a spy. This individual would establish a legitimate, self-sustaining business as a high-end art restorer and consultant, specializing in authenticating old masters, a niche that would grant them access to the very private collections and secretive dealings where the alchemist was believed to operate. The mission's success hinged on the operative's ability to become so indispensable to the art world's gray market that their services would eventually be sought out by, or on behalf of, the alchemist's network. It was a strategy of seduction rather than infiltration, a plan to make the target come to them. The analysis of obstacles was a sobering exercise for the operations planners. The technical challenges were significant, requiring the development of bespoke surveillance and communication equipment that could be seamlessly integrated into the tools of an art restorer's trade without any possibility of detection, even under expert scrutiny. The linguistic and cultural barriers were formidable. The operative needed not just fluent French, German, and Italian, but a native-level understanding of the specific dialects and sociolects of the European upper class. A single misplaced idiom or grammatical error could betray them as an outsider. The greatest risk, however, was the psychological toll of deep cover. The operative would be completely isolated for years, with contact with their handler limited to highly infrequent and securely managed encounters. They would need to build genuine relationships, friendships, professional partnerships, perhaps even romantic entanglements, all of which would be predicated on a lie and would need to be ruthlessly exploited for intelligence. The risk of exposure was constant, and the consequences of failure were absolute. If unmasked, the operative would not simply be arrested. They would be eliminated by the alchemist's network with brutal efficiency, and the Israeli government would disavow all knowledge of their existence. Furthermore, a failure would burn the entire operational concept, alerting the alchemist and making the art world permanently impenetrable to future intelligence efforts. The plan was a tightrope, walk over a chasm, with no safety net. The technological preparation for Operation Gilded Cage was a masterpiece of miniaturization and clandestine innovation, undertaken by the agency's dedicated technical services division, Neviot. The objective was to equip the operative with a full suite of intelligence-gathering tools that were not merely concealed, but were functionally integrated into her professional equipment. A portable X-ray fluorescence XRF spectrometer, a standard tool for analyzing the elemental composition of pigments, was subtly modified. While its primary function remained intact, providing a perfect justification for its presence, a secondary module was installed, capable of scanning and cloning RFID chips and capturing Wi-Fi and Bluetooth data traffic in its immediate vicinity. The device's internal battery compartment was designed to double as a concealed dead drop, accessible only by a specific sequence of pressure and temperature applications. Her palette knives and scalpels, used for the delicate work of removing old varnish, were constructed from a non-magnetic ceramic composite, but their handles contained high-frequency audio recorders activated by a precise twisting motion. The most ingenious device was a digital microscope used for examining canvas weaves and craquelure. It connected to a tablet via a secure, encrypted Bluetooth link to display its imagery, but embedded within the data stream of the images themselves, through a sophisticated steganographic algorithm, was the operative's communication channel to her handlers. She could send and receive detailed reports, schematics, and photographs disguised as microscopic images of 17th-century linen canvas, a form of communication that would be invisible to any standard digital forensic analysis. The selection process for the operative was exhaustive, lasting nearly 9 months. The candidate could not be a career field agent. Their tradecraft, however refined, would eventually betray itself. The psychological profile required a unique blend of extreme patience, intellectual curiosity, high emotional intelligence, and a capacity for profound compartmentalization. They found their candidate not in the military or intelligence services, but in the forensic accounting unit of the Israeli National Police. Her name was Leora Ben David. Leora was a prodigy, a woman who saw the world in patterns and systems. Before becoming an accountant, she had earned a master's degree in chemistry and had been a passionate amateur painter. She possessed a near photographic memory and the quiet, observant demeanor of a scholar. Crucially, her motivation was intensely personal. Her younger brother, a student on a backpacking trip through Europe, had been killed in the Brussels bombings. When the nature of the mission was explained to her in a series of carefully managed interviews, she did not display overt anger or a desire for vengeance, but a cold, analytical resolve. Her grief had been transmuted into a powerful, focused purpose. She saw the mission not as an act of retribution, but as the logical conclusion of an equation that had been left unbalanced. She accepted the assignment with the quiet determination of someone who had found the one task for which her entire life, with all its skills and its sorrows, had prepared her. Leora's transformation into Alani Severin was a 2-year process of total immersion. She was removed from her life, her apartment emptied, her digital footprint erased, and her death officially recorded as the result of a hiking accident. For the first year, she lived in a secure training facility, a perfect replica of the Geneva apartment she would eventually inhabit. Her days were a grueling regimen of study and practice. Mornings were spent with a former curator from the Louvre, who drilled her in the nuances of art history, from the brushwork of Rembrandt to the political subtext of Venetian portraiture. Afternoons were spent in a laboratory with a master art restorer, where she learned the physical craft, how to mix pigments using historical formulas, how to repair a torn canvas with microscopic precision, how to identify forgeries by analyzing the chemical decay of organic binders. Evenings were dedicated to language and cultural immersion. Tutors coached her not just in formal French, but in the specific argot of the Geneva art scene, the subtle distinctions in accent and vocabulary that separated old money from new. She studied the family histories of Europe's great industrial and banking dynasties, the gossip of the auction houses, the rivalries between gallery owners. Simultaneously, she underwent intensive training in the unstated curriculum of her true profession: defensive driving, unarmed combat designed for close quarters, the art of detecting and evading surveillance, and the psychological techniques of elicitation and manipulation. She was not just learning a role. She was being systematically rebuilt, her old identity stripped away and replaced, layer by layer, with the persona of Alani Severine. The construction of Alani Severine's cover identity, her legend, was as complex and detailed as the restoration of a priceless artifact. The agency's mythmakers created a complete, verifiable life story for her. She was born in Montreal to a wealthy, reclusive French-Canadian family that had made its fortune in timber. This explained her slight, unplaceable North American accent and provided a source for her independent wealth, which was channeled through a series of legitimate, arm's-length trusts managed by a law firm in Zurich that was, in reality, a Mossad front. Her academic records were falsified, but with painstaking care, inserting her into the archives of the Sorbonne and the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. A portfolio of her supposed restoration work was created, using digitally altered photographs of real projects, complete with fabricated client testimonials and invoices. Her digital presence was carefully aged over a period of 18 months. Social media profiles were created, populated with innocuous posts about art exhibitions and travel, and backdated to appear as if they had existed for years. Even her personal tastes were curated to reinforce her cover. She was given a preference for obscure Baroque composers and a mild allergy to shellfish, details designed to add texture and authenticity to her persona. The final, brilliant touch was the 2 Persian cats. They were not just props, they served a vital operational purpose. They provided a plausible reason for her to refuse last-minute travel or invitations to stay overnight at country estates, giving her a built-in excuse to return to the security of her apartment and its communication equipment. The cats, like everything else in her life, were a function of the mission. In the late summer of 2013, Alani Severine arrived in Geneva. Her insertion was deliberately quiet and unremarkable. She leased the pre-selected apartment, had her equipment and belongings shipped from a holding facility in Antwerp, and spent the first 6 months establishing a routine of mundane normalcy. She became a regular at a local cafe. She established accounts with art supply stores, and she joined a local historical society. Her operational activities were limited to passive surveillance, mapping the social and professional networks of the city's art scene. She attended gallery openings and auctions not to make contact, but to be seen, to become a familiar, non-threatening part of the landscape. Her first professional move was carefully calculated. She identified a mid-tier auction house that was selling a painting attributed to a student of Anthony van Dyck. Using her own funds, funneled through her trust, she purchased the painting for a modest sum. She then spent 2 months meticulously restoring it, documenting every step on a professional blog that had been created for her. During the restoration, she discovered a hidden signature and details in the underpainting that, through rigorous technical analysis, all of which was genuine, proved the work was not by a student, but was in fact an early, unrecorded work by Van Dyck himself. She published her findings in a respected art journal. The painting was subsequently authenticated by the Van Dyck Research Project and resold at a major auction in London for over £3 million. The event established her reputation instantly. She was not just a competent restorer. She was a scholar, a discoverer of lost treasures, a woman with a golden touch. The art world began to take notice. The target of the operation's second phase was a man named Jean-Luc Martel, the owner of a prestigious gallery in Geneva's Old Town. Martel was a smooth, cultured operator in his late 60s, a fixture of the European art scene. Intelligence had long identified him as a gray figure, a facilitator who used his gallery's legitimate business to provide discreet services for less savory clients. He was not a terrorist or an ideologue, but an amoral businessman who specialized in laundering money for a variety of customers, from Russian oligarchs to South American cartel leaders. He was believed to be one of the alchemist's primary gateways into the legitimate art market, a man who could take a large sum of illicit cash and transform it into a piece of art with an impeccable, albeit fabricated, provenance. Alani's approach to Martel was indirect and patient. She did not seek him out, but created the conditions for him to seek her out. She began to offer her consulting services to wealthy collectors, several of whom were clients of Martel's gallery. She built a reputation for her discretion and her uncanny ability to spot forgeries that had fooled even seasoned experts. After she discreetly saved one of Martel's most important clients from paying a fortune for a fake Degas sculpture, Martel had no choice but to acknowledge her. He invited her to lunch, ostensibly to thank her, but in reality, to assess her. The cultivation of Jean-Luc Martel was a slow, delicate dance of mutual assessment that lasted for more than a year. Alani presented herself as a purist, a scholar who was slightly disdainful of the commercial aspects of the art world. This posture was a carefully designed psychological ploy. It made her appear non-threatening and positioned her as a valuable tool rather than a competitor. She understood that a man like Martel, who dealt in deception, would be deeply suspicious of anyone who seemed too eager or too perfect. Her occasional scholarly aloofness and her obsessive focus on technical detail made her authentic. She offered her services to him on a freelance basis, helping to authenticate pieces he was considering acquiring for his gallery. This gave her legitimate access to his storerooms, his records, and his network. She never asked about his clients or the source of his funds. Her focus was always strictly on the art. This professional discipline earned his trust. He began to rely on her judgment, confiding in her about the challenges of dealing with demanding, eccentric collectors. It was during one of these conversations that he first mentioned a particularly reclusive and important client, a man who only communicated through his legal representatives and who had an insatiable appetite for 17th-century Dutch landscapes, the very field in which Alani had established her public expertise. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that she was getting close. The breakthrough came 18 months after her initial contact with Martel. The reclusive client had acquired a painting, supposedly a newly discovered Vermeer, for an astronomical sum. However, the client's own experts had raised doubts about its authenticity. The client was demanding an independent, definitive analysis, and he wanted the best. Martel, with his own reputation on the line, came to Alani. He explained that the client was exceptionally paranoid about security and privacy. The examination could not take place in her studio or his gallery. She would have to travel to the client's private estate on Lake Como and conduct the analysis on site. She would be required to sign a formidable non-disclosure agreement and would not be permitted to bring any personal electronic devices. Alani feigned reluctance, citing her busy schedule and her dislike of travel. This was a critical part of the protocol. Her feigned hesitation increased her value and dispelled any suspicion of eagerness. After a week of negotiation, conducted through Martel, she agreed. Her handler, in a burst of steganographic data hidden within an image of a canvas weave, confirmed that this was the moment they had been waiting for. The estate on Lake Como was the primary suspected residence of the alchemist. Her mission objectives were confirmed. First, obtain positive visual identification of the target. Second, deploy the custom-built XRF spectrometer near the estate's central network hub to plant a passive intelligence-gathering worm on their Wi-Fi network. Third, leave no trace of her true purpose. The final preparations were a tense, meticulous drill. Alani spent days practicing with an identical, unmodified XRF spectrometer, rehearsing the precise sequence of operations that would activate its hidden secondary function. The activation required a specific four-step process, pressing 2 recessed buttons simultaneously for a period of exactly 3 seconds, followed by entering a specific temperature setting on the device's control panel. This sequence was designed to be indistinguishable from the normal calibration procedure for the device. Her technical briefing included detailed satellite imagery and blueprints of the Lake Como estate, which had been obtained by a separate intelligence unit. The likely location of the primary network server was identified as a small library adjacent to the main study, chosen for its central location and climate control. Her cover story for needing access to that specific room was simple and plausible. She would explain that the optimal lighting for spectroscopic analysis was indirect, diffuse daylight, and the library's north-facing windows were perfect. The psychological preparation was equally intense. Her handler reinforced the parameters of the mission. This was not an assassination or a capture. It was a pure intelligence operation. Her role was to be a ghost, to enter, to plant the seed of the network's destruction, and to vanish, leaving the target completely unaware that he had been compromised. Upon arrival at the sprawling, heavily secured estate, Alani was met by a team of professional, impassive security guards. Her equipment was thoroughly inspected. The XRF spectrometer was unpacked, powered on, and examined by a technician who was clearly knowledgeable about such equipment. He ran a standard diagnostic, and the machine performed exactly as it should. The hours of work by the Nevio engineers had paid off. The clandestine modifications were invisible to expert inspection. She was then escorted into the main house, a magnificent villa filled with priceless art. She was introduced to her host, a man who called himself Mr. Corbin. He was a distinguished, silver-haired man in his early 60s, with cold, intelligent eyes and the soft-spoken, confident air of someone accustomed to absolute power. As he spoke about the disputed Vermeer, his vocabulary and his deep understanding of the painting's historical context matched the psychological profile of the alchemist perfectly. While she could not be 100% certain, the visual confirmation, combined with the context, was enough. She had found him. The first objective was complete. The execution of the mission's second phase was a study in controlled tension. Alani spent the first few hours conducting a legitimate, thorough examination of the painting in the main gallery, using her microscope and other tools. She spoke at length with Corbin, impressing him with her knowledge and her meticulous methodology. As the afternoon light began to fade, she enacted the next step of her plan. She explained to Corbin that to get a definitive reading on the chemical composition of the underlayers of paint, she needed to use the XRF spectrometer in a room with consistent, indirect northern light to avoid any spectral contamination from direct sunlight. She gestured towards the adjoining library, which she knew from the satellite blueprints had the correct orientation. Corbin, eager for a definitive answer about his expensive acquisition, readily agreed. He personally escorted her into the library, a room paneled in dark wood and lined with thousands of books. In a small, ventilated alcove, exactly where the intelligence had predicted, was a discreet cabinet housing the estate's central server and network router. As Corbin watched, she carefully set up the spectrometer on a table, a few feet away from the network hub. She began the device's calibration sequence, her fingers moving with practiced, steady precision. She pressed the two recessed buttons, held them for the required 3 seconds, and then keyed in the activation code disguised as a temperature setting. A tiny, almost imperceptible LED on the device blinked green once. The worm was deployed. It would now silently copy all data traffic passing through the network and transmit it, in encrypted, compressed bursts, to a Mossad listening post via a satellite uplink. The entire process took less than 90 seconds and was performed in plain sight of the target. The rest of the day was an exercise in methodical disengagement. Alani completed her analysis of the painting, delivering her verdict to Corbin with professional solemnity. The painting, she concluded, was a masterful forgery, likely from the 19th century, but definitively not a Vermeer. She showed him the spectroscopic evidence of zinc white, a pigment not available in Vermeer's time, in the ground layer. Corbin took the news with surprising equanimity, seeming more impressed by her technical skill than disappointed by the financial loss. He thanked her for her discretion and professionalism. She packed her equipment under the watchful eyes of his security team and was escorted off the estate. During the drive back to Milan, where she would catch a flight to Geneva, the immense psychological strain of the past 24 hours finally registered. Her hands, which had been perfectly steady while handling the equipment in front of the alchemist, now trembled uncontrollably. She had walked into the lion's den, performed her task, and walked out, leaving the lion completely unaware of the mortal wound she had inflicted. The second and third objectives were complete. The aftermath of Operation Gilded Cage unfolded over the next 6 months with devastating, systemic precision. The data flowing from the worm planted on the alchemist's network was a fire hose of intelligence. For the first time, the agency could see the entire architecture of his financial empire. They mapped his network of shell corporations, his cryptocurrency wallets, his hawala contacts, and his network of complicit bankers and lawyers. Every transaction, every communication between his lieutenants, every planned movement of funds was now visible in real time. The intelligence was disseminated to allied agencies in the United States and Europe. A coordinated, global takedown was planned. In a single, 8-hour period, law enforcement and intelligence agencies in 14 different countries executed hundreds of raids. Bank accounts were frozen, servers were seized, and dozens of key nodes in the Black Star Brigade's financial network, including the gallery owner Jean-Luc Martel, were arrested. The financial decapitation was swift and total. The flow of money to the brigade ceased overnight, and the organization, starved of its lifeblood, began to wither. The ultimate fate of the alchemist himself was never made public. The intelligence gathered from the Lake Como server provided his true identity, his travel patterns, and the locations of his other safe houses. Several months after the network takedown, a small, unattributed article in an Italian newspaper reported that a prominent, reclusive financier had died in a single-car accident on a mountain road in the Swiss Alps. There were no other witnesses. The case was ruled an accident. Within the quiet, sterile offices of the Institute, the file on the alchemist was closed. The strategic value of the intelligence Alani had gathered was immeasurable. It not only dismantled a major terrorist financing operation, but also provided a new, comprehensive blueprint for how such networks operated, influencing financial intelligence doctrine for years to come. The political and diplomatic repercussions were minimal, as the public-facing actions were all carried out by local law enforcement agencies based on actionable financial intelligence. The quiet, covert action that had made it all possible remained a closely guarded secret. For Leora Ben David, the end of the mission was not a victory parade, but a slow, difficult re-entry into a world she no longer recognized. The persona of Alani Severin was dismantled as carefully as it had been built. She sold the restoration business to a legitimate art expert, gave the cats to a friendly neighbor, and quietly left Geneva, her apartment once again becoming just an apartment. She was debriefed for weeks in a secure facility, every detail of her years in deep cover meticulously recorded and analyzed. She was offered a senior position within the agency, a desk job as an analyst or a trainer, but she refused. The psychological cost of the operation had been profound. The years of sustained deception, of living in a state of constant, low-level paranoia, had fundamentally altered her. She had built a life, a career, and relationships, all in the service of a lie. The clinical detachment that had made her so effective had also hollowed her out, leaving a void that no mission success could fill. The grief for her brother, which had been the initial catalyst, had been processed and weaponized, but it had not been resolved. She left the Institute, taking a new identity provided by the state, and disappeared into a quiet, anonymous life, forever a ghost of her own making, a woman who had saved countless lives at the cost of her own. Is it a justifiable act for a state to sacrifice the identity and psychological well-being of an individual for the greater security of the many? At what point do the methods used to fight monsters risk turning us into them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel.